Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, in her speech, the Prime Minister said she would dedicate her premiership to delivering what she called the British dream of each generation doing better than the last two young voters. But, of course, they have been crucially lacking in terms of the support which the Conservatives have managed to engender in the recent election. And our political correspondent, Lewis Goodall, is in the key constituency of the city of Chester, where he's been speaking to voters and getting their reaction. Lewis.
Yes, Adam, we've been showing Theresa May's speech to voters in Chester, getting quite a bit of interest, I have to say, perhaps to my surprise. Lots of people stopping, waiting to see what the Prime Minister has to say. And I have to say that throughout much of it, it was the classic generational divide that we've all come to know and expect from recent politics. Older voters saying that they approved of what she was saying, that they felt that she was someone who would look after them, as would the Conservatives, and also saying that they liked some of the Corbyn bashing as well, because they said, we remember the 1970s, we need to take on the hard left. We remember what it was like living with nationalised industries and the hard left in control of the Labour Party. Young voters not really having much truck with that at all. When a bit of the speech where Theresa May was talking about the 1970s, young voter turned to me and said, I just don't remember any of that. Why is any of that irrelevant at all? And that's important in a city like Chester, which used to be a very marginal seat for the Labour Party. Only had a majority at the last election of just over 90. It's now got an enormous majority of 9,000, and that's largely because Jeremy Corbyn did manage to propel a lot of this new coalition comprised of not just young voters but graduates and families as well. Obviously not so receptive to what Theresa May had to say. In terms of the bit of the speech that we're all talking about, of course, which is Theresa May's personal difficulties with delivering the speech, I have to say that a lot of the voters who watched it with us were rather sympathetic to the Prime Minister. They thought, one woman said to me, look, I've got a cold as well, I've got up in the morning, so has the Prime Minister, good on her for making the speech. I do think, though, despite that, and despite the fact that much of the public, I think, will probably be generous and feel for the Prime Minister, their heart will go out to her, I think nonetheless there was a feeling from some of the voters here that it just seemed to be the final nail in the coffin, if you like, that she'd had such a tumultuous and such a difficult year, and this was compounded, because after all, if the Prime Minister had won the huge majority, a 100 majority or so that we all expected, none of this would have mattered. People have just thought, oh, she's just having a bad day, but she would still be the Boudicca of politics, if you like. This just seems to have topped off what was already a really, really rather dismal year for the Prime Minister.
Taxpayers allowed, so
No, Telegraph.
Thank you very much indeed, Lewis. Well, let's get some reaction from some of the journalists looking at this morning's events at the Conservative Party Conference. With me, Dear Chakrabarti of the Telegraph, and also Kevin Maguire of the Mirror. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
What did you make of it?
It was excruciating to watch. I think that's a general consensus at a human level. It was just incredible.
But does that matter? I mean, you know, it was clearly difficult physical moment for the Prime Minister. Does that matter?
Actually, in a sense, I think it won her a lot more sympathy from sort of unusual quarters. I will hear what Kevin thought of it. But she did carry on. I mean, before even halfway through her speech, that P45 moment happened. And she dealt with it sort of admirably well. And then her voice gave in. I mean, all the stuff, the nightmares happened to her, but she finished it to the end. That was quite admirable.
I think it matters hugely. It was excruciating, but that could be politically favourable.
Yeah, but anybody can lose their voice.
She needed to be strong and commanding at the end of what's been a very bad week for her. Boris Johnson stole her conference. She needed to show she was strong and stable to coil the kind of phrase. She was weak and wobbly. Your voice going like that, struggling to get through that speech, letters falling off the back of the stage as you're doing it. Forget the comedian in a way, that was just a little sideshow. But that wasn't a Prime Minister who will have instilled confidence in her cabinet, in her MPs, in her party, or the country. We saw her deflate on live TV in front of the nation. It's very hard, Adam, to come back from that.
What about the comedian? You say forget the comedian, and, you know, a lot of people will wonder whether there's anything comical about what he did, but that type of humour is very prevalent, and the point is it was making a point, wasn't it?
It was a serious security breach, if nothing else. It was quite concerning. There were some tweets going on saying if this happened in the US, for example, it would have been a very difficult very difficult situation for the comedian involved.
Look, we live in a democracy. People are always going to get close to our politicians. I'm quite proud of that, and I'm glad they're not shot when they do, and they're not armed, and they're not posing a threat. It's embarrassing for her. It's embarrassing for the Conservative Party. There will be an inquiry, how did he get it passed? But the humiliation was personal. It was her struggling on, and we've seen her have difficulties all this week. She's not strong enough to sack Boris Johnson either for disloyalty, betraying her, stupidity, whatever it is. Other cabinet ministers want him gone. If they make a move against her now, if the cabinet decides, rather than this slow, lingering, painful death of their party, they want to roll the dice and try Johnson or somebody else, she won't be able to do anything about it now.
She has repositioned herself, though. She's made the apology for the election. She's basically come out for moderate Brexit, if one can call it, rather than hard Brexit as last year. She's regrouped her policies around helping the next generation and made some moves in that direction. Couldn't that be the basis for a relaunch?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the speech itself, it was a pretty shoddy speech, if you ask me. You know, where are the policies in there? The energy cap was deemed as Marxist in 2013 by the Tories. You know, so there's very little to cheer about in that speech. But with all the human things happening, with all the sort of the unluck folding the way it did, it would be very difficult for a lot of her cabinet colleagues to actually do anything now. I think because she has the party sympathy to a certain extent.
To those young voters, isn't there? Now?
Yeah, not much of an offer though, is it? Because if you look at on tuition fees, what she's saying, I'm going to create more students who are going to be 50,000 plus average in debt. It's not a big offer. I've come from the Downing Street briefing, or the party briefing, struggling on the detail of how the energy cap will work. On council housing, it looks like it's going to be 25,000 homes over 5 years. There are 1.2 million people on the waiting list before you go into substandard private accommodation. The fact home ownership is falling. So it may have sounded better in the speech when she managed to get the words out, when she croaked through them, than when you put this under the magnifying glass, you begin to take it apart and you look what it is. And I'm afraid it doesn't look like it's going to be very much. Not enough for a relaunch.
We've had that before in party leaders' speeches at conferences.
Of all parties, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair would do that too. That's nothing unusual, but I've never in 30 years of going to party conferences watched somebody collapse so publicly and so painfully at the podium on their big set piece when it's all supposed to draw a line under a bad week and relaunch her for the months ahead.
Now, what about what ministers and MPs I've been speaking to here seem to regard as their trump card, which Mrs May harped on about again? You know, Jeremy Corbyn is not same old Labour. Jeremy Corbyn is a dangerous, lover of terrorists, Marxist, who wants to nationalise. They seem to think that will, in the end, work for them.
Well, the rhetoric was there that, I stand for free market. She was saying, don't tell me free market doesn't work. And I was thinking, I thought it was your side, really, in your administration, who was saying that free markets don't work. But what did we see in the policy which suggested that this government was in any way free market? I do not know. But nobody can call her a Maybot anymore, I don't think. We saw the most human side of that.
Well, it was a malfunctioning Maybot, wasn't it?
Kevin, what about this attack on Corbyn? I mean, you're part of the Labour Party, Well,
no, I'm not a member. The Daily Mirror does support the Labour Party.
But the Daily Mirror was never that enthusiastic about Jeremy Corbyn. Could this tell in the end, this sort of attack on him as a hard left figure?
I'm not sure it works. It didn't work in the general election. People just don't grasp it. If that's all they've got, they're in difficulty. I think going on to his policy territory, which they're doing, whether it's universities, whether it's council house building, even organ donation, something the Daily Mirror's campaigned 2 hard, long years for, and she's come on side after Wales and Scotland. Corbyn and Labour were there ahead of her. They've got to beat them on ideas and policies and look commanding, look as if they know what they're doing. And I'm afraid that was not a Prime Minister who looked like what she was doing. She'll get a bit of human sympathy, deserves a bit of human sympathy, but she's not going to convince many people because they won't believe she's going to fight the next election. Those in the Tory party who wanted that, well, look, they're not going to win that argument at all now. She failed in the last election. You look at her performance there today. That is an ailing, struggling Prime Minister on her way out.
So how do you think this plays out from here then?
Well, I'm less impressed with the speech itself and what it involved. Quite impressed with how she stuck through it, the resilience.
So she can stick around for a while, you think?
We'll see. It will be it'll be difficult, I think, at this moment for her cabinet to criticise her.
Let's hope she can find a GP surgery without a big queue.
All right. Well, thank you both very much indeed. Well, that was the Prime Minister's speech, possibly the climactic moment of the party conference season, but very difficult for her given the problems she had with her voice and also an interruption by a self-declared comedian. You're watching Sky News.
And again, you're watching Sky News. Theresa May's speech to the Conservative Party conference was supposed to reboot her leadership, but instead it's likely to be remembered for the interruptions by a comedian, her coughing fit, and a set falling apart around her. So how much damage will it do to her long-term? Philip Blond is a former Cameron advisor, now a director of Respublica. He is in our Westminster studio. Hello to you. Thank you for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. If it had been your leader, would you have had your head in your hands?
Well, I think everybody, you know, on a human level would have felt for her and did feel for her. I think, you know, the great criticism of Theresa May is she can't emote. Well, here she did emote, and she showed kind of aspects of her personality of, you know, soldiering on. I mean, what's clear from this is, you know, this is a woman who won't resign or stand down. She will carry out her duty as she sees it to the very limit, if necessary. So I think in that aspect, it sort of creates a form of sympathy around her that she hasn't really had before. But if I look at the speech itself and what it represented, it seemed very incoherent. If you go back to when she first spoke and first entered Downing Street, her first conference speech, it was a recognition that markets as currently constructed don't work for ordinary people. And we know they don't work for ordinary people. We've got wage stagnation on a level that we haven't seen since the Napoleonic Wars. Ordinary people who she wants to speak to are struggling. So it's very weird for her to go back to the 1980s and start talking about markets are working, because that isn't how you beat what Jeremy Corbyn is trying to do, which is to have a 1970s solution. You don't go back to having a 1980s response to a 1970s solution. That isn't part of the future. Okay. And I think the other aspect that was really troubling is there were no big ideas at all. All the policies were tiny, were incremental, were very, very small, and will make absolutely no at-scale difference whatsoever. Okay. And at least if you go back to the 1980s, you know, Thatcherism was full of big transformative ideas. So it was sort of like, on the policy level, the worst of both worlds. And I think
let me get a word in edgeways here. Let me get a word in edgeways. Thank you. I'm glad you were talking about the body of the speech, because we think it might have been plagiarised a little bit from the West Wing. Here we go.
It's when tested the most that we reach deep within ourselves and find that our capacity to rise to the challenge before us may well be limitless.
But every time we think we've measured our capacity to meet a challenge, we look up and we're reminded that that capacity may well be limitless.
Oh dear, Philip. Oh dear.
Goodness me. I think what this shows is that in number 10, the people around her, nobody's in sufficient charge. You know, with the departure of Nick Timothy, whatever one thinks about him, he was clearly a man of ideas and direction. And this speech didn't have any ideas and didn't have any direction. And then the clip you've just played, I mean, that's a different kind of wince. That's a different kind of embarrassment. What they really need to do is, if they want to get out of this tailspin, and they can, is to restore somebody who is in control of ideas, direction, ideology, if you will, because at the moment it looks really spasmodic, and the clip you've just played is, well, quite frankly, embarrassing.
Good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
It was an opportunity for the Prime Minister to reassert her authority over her party and present her big policy ideas to the country. But Theresa May's speech at the Conservative Party conference turned into something of an ordeal as she struggled to speak through an insistent cough, a prankster who interrupted her with a P45, and, to add insult to injury, 2 of the letters of the party slogan fell off the wall behind her. But she did announce a number of new policies, including plans to end what she called rip-off energy prices with a new cap on bills, and making £2 billion available for 25,000 council homes or social housing. More on those in a moment, but first our political editor Laura Kuensberg was watching the speech at the conference in Manchester, and her report contains some flash photography.
A wobble, a wave, and a long, lonely walk. Her colleagues fixing those smiles for the camera. A clear of the throat before what was meant to be a comeback. Sorry was not the hardest word at all, but it was the first important one.
We did not get the victory we wanted because our national campaign fell short. It was too scripted, too presidential, and it allowed the Labour Party to paint us as the voice of continuity when the public wanted to hear a message of change. I hold my hands up for that. I take responsibility. I led the campaign, and I am sorry.
For her husband and closest staff, this speech was to take the party by the scruff of its neck and move on. But then,
and it's the Conservative Party,
just as she was finding her stride, out of the corner of her eye, a piece of paper was proffered. In the buttoned-up guise of a Tory activist, a man interrupted Theresa May. Stand-up comedian Simon Brodkin handing her a fake P45.
Boris, job done there. Given her the P45.
To start with, neither the Prime Minister nor anyone else knew what was going on. A stunt during the biggest speech of the most powerful politician in the country.
Good job. Done.
Leave, please.
Thank you. Good stuff.
With terribly British polite irritation, the Cabinet tried to get him to leave.
Boris asked me! But Boris, please say you did this! You asked me to, and now you're denying it!
Before eventually, security guards and chants from the crowd got him out.
What's your name? This is a P45, of course. You have a P45? Yes, from Boris. From Boris Johnson? Yes.
It was allegedly a joke. Nothing to do with the Foreign Secretary. The man bundled out through the exhibition hall, chased by reporters. There could be trouble for the conference organisers. A man cleared by the tight security here.
Anything to say, sir?
Causing trouble within inches of the Prime Minister, ending up in handcuffs. Back in the hall, an ovation in support to will her on. Even though there has been chatter about her suitability for the job for weeks. It was at least good fodder for a joke at Labour's expense.
I was about to talk about somebody I'd like to give a P45 to, and that's Jeremy Corbyn.
As she tried to press on to make the case for markets, new plans for housing, schools and capping energy bills, she began to falter. Stuffed with a cold all week, what were meant to be bold statements were repeatedly choked by coughs.
The deficit is back to pre-crisis levels. Sounds as if my voice isn't on track.
More than an hour on the podium. In some moments it felt as if she wouldn't go on. The Home Secretary telling colleagues to get to their feet for ovations, to give the Prime Minister time to recover. The Chancellor, yes, the Chancellor, passing cough sweets to try to help.
I hope you notice that, ladies and gentlemen, the Chancellor giving something away free.
This was an ordeal, miles from a heart-swelling speech. And as if a prank and a dreadful cough weren't enough, watch this. Theresa May's slogan literally falling apart as she spoke. But word by word, phrase by phrase, she doggedly ground on to the end.
Let us fulfil our duty to the British people. Let us fulfil our duty to our country. Let us fulfil our duty to Britain and let us renew the British dream. Thank you.
Trying to contain her cough, but perhaps distress too. It was clearly a feat just to get through it. Those who eye her job swearing loyalty today. Imagine this happening to you on your most important day at work of the year. Her husband comforting rather than celebrating with her at the end. But she led the party into an election she didn't have to call, losing her majority and much of her authority. A precious commodity today's speech was intended to restore.
That speech was less the British dream. It felt like a nightmare in the hall. I mean, it was a real struggle, wasn't it? Not just because of her voice.
No, I don't think it felt like a struggle at all. I think it was really ambitious, some clear proposals for reforms, ambitious on housing, which I think is what we all know needs to be addressed.
It was a brilliant speech, and I think the most important thing is that she set out her vision for how to renew the British dream.
She fought through and came out triumphantly and made a great speech despite having problems with her throat.
Great speech.
Great speech.
How was the speech, sir? Great speech. Went to the things that people matter.
That will be remembered.
Some of the audience clearly dumbfounded by what they'd just seen.
I feel she needs to resign. As soon as she goes, the better for the party.
So what if she had a bit of a cough? She's human.
Good on you, Theresa. Keep going.
Conference speeches can make or break political leaders. It is as simple as that. And the air in here was deeply, deeply awkward at times. The crowd willing the Prime Minister just to get through it. No leader wants a sympathy vote. Yet Theresa May's allies are already praising the resilience that she showed today.
There is drift in this party. The conference was a chance to set a direction again, to stop power deserting her. The Prime Minister has put her arguments, but will they really be heard? This was her answer to her terrible luck this afternoon. Now for her party and for you to answer her. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Manchester.
Well, despite the battle to make her voice heard, Mrs May did make a series of policy announcements in her speech. Our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, takes a look now at the detail of the Prime Minister's pledges.
Theresa May's big speech was meant to be a crowd pleaser. Pledges and policies to show those feeling the pinch she's on their side and try to get Tory doubters back on hers.
Let me tell you something.
So she came with plans to help out in the housing market and give a hand with fuel bills. The Tories promised to cap energy bills before the last election, then dropped the idea. The Treasury never liked what it saw as crude interference in the market. Energy companies claim losing revenue could mean cuts in vital investment, but Mrs May was out to help hard-pressed customers.
The energy market punishes loyalty with higher prices. And the most loyal customers are often those with lower incomes, the elderly, people with lower qualifications, and people who rent their homes. Those who, for whatever reason, are unable to find the time to shop around. That's why next week, this government will publish a draft bill to put a price cap on energy bills.
It's become hard or impossible for many to afford a home or pay the rent. Councils want freedom to borrow money for building, but the government says no to more public debt. Today, the Prime Minister called it her mission to solve the problem. Not nearly the kind of cash councils and campaigners want, but there would be more.
For 30 or 40 years, we simply haven't built enough homes. As a result, prices have risen so much that the average home now costs almost 8 times average earnings. And that's been a disaster for young people in particular. Today, I can announce that we will invest an additional £2 billion in affordable housing, taking the government's total affordable housing budget to almost £9 billion.
So more promises of more state intervention. Too much for some Tories. On health, organs could be automatically used for transplants in England unless people deny permission before death. On education, the Prime Minister promised 100 free schools will be set up each year to give more choice. The Tories have set themselves the job of rebuilding faith in free markets and their ability to manage them before they face Labour again at the next election. But they're confronting huge problems with very little money. As one senior minister said to me, we could never hope to rebuild our popularity this week. That will take years. John Pienaar, BBC News, Manchester.
Well, let's hear from Laura again in Manchester. Laura, the Prime Minister's speech today was such an important moment for her in so many ways. She clearly has a terrible cold. She can't help that. But do you think, in your assessment, she's been damaged by her performance today?
Well, Fiona, to say it didn't go according to plan is probably the understatement of the political year. Almost everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. She had basically a terrible run of luck with the prank, the voice, the sign falling apart behind her on the stage. But I've talked to several cabinet ministers this afternoon who've suggested, who are guessing, I suppose, that most MPs will want to rally round, who are pleased that she did talk more personally about her own vision, who believe that she did manage to set out a coherent vision of what she wants to do with the country, despite the terrible croaky voice and the sort of gruelling physical ordeal that you could see she was having to go through. That said, in other parts of the party, there are senior MPs who now believe this could perhaps be the beginning of the end for Theresa May. And of course, this afternoon, MPs are now in conversation with each other, texting furiously backwards and forwards, trying to work out what they do next. I think, frankly, it's just too soon to say at the moment whether or not this is going to be the beginning of a dramatic few days or a dramatic few weeks that could change things very, very fundamentally. But, you know, since the election, there's sort of been a post-election pact among Tory MPs and ministers, if you like, that after that disappointment for the Conservatives, Theresa May would be able to and should stay on through the course of the Brexit negotiations for the next couple of years. But tonight, certainly that truce, that uneasy pact that they reached after their disappointment in the summer is certainly under strain, and it's not impossible that it could break in the coming weeks.
Laura in Manchester, thank you.
On Brexit, cabinet unity, even her ability to lead, the stakes for Theresa May could not have been higher. It had to be a memorable speech, and it was, but for all the wrong reasons. Her demand for unity, fresh cash for housing, even confirmation of an energy price cap were all clouded by a persistent cough. That a prankster got through to interrupt her too begs questions over security and party competence. Our political editor Robert Peston was there for the Prime Minister's speech of a lifetime that came apart at the seams.
Minutes before giving the most important speech of her life.
Prime Minister, are you going to take back control this morning?
Her first Tory conference since she lost her government's majority. A speech to regain her members' confidence in her leadership.
We did not get the victory we wanted because our national campaign fell short. It was too scripted, too presidential, and it allowed the Labour Party to paint us as the voice of continuity when the public wanted to hear a message of change. I hold my hands up for that. I take responsibility. I led the campaign, and I am sorry.
And then to her big idea.
This is the conservatism I believe in. A conservatism of fairness and justice and opportunity for all. A conservatism that keeps the British dream alive for a new generation. That's what I'm in this for, and that's what we must all be in this for.
It was all going to plan. But then,
while our opponents flirt with a foreign policy of neutrality,
a prankster who shockingly got through the security ring of steel.
Boris, job done there.
To deliver her a mock P45 or notice of dismissal, a dig at the leadership ambitions of the Foreign Secretary.
Good job. That was done.
Party conference or soap opera?
I was about to talk about somebody I'd like to give a P45 to, and that's Jeremy Corbyn.
Carry on, Prime Minister. Back on track till...
Why we will never... excuse me. We will never hesitate to act where businesses aren't operating as they should. Let this party celebrate the wealth creators, the risk takers, the innovators and entrepreneurs.
Home Secretary to Foreign Secretary, show some solidarity.
I hope you notice that, ladies and gentlemen, the Chancellor giving something away free.
As for Philip Hammond's medicine...
And we... shows what good the Chancellor's cough suite is.
She battled on gamely, never quite losing that frog, but finally delivering a couple of biggish announcements.
Today, I can announce that we will invest an additional £2 billion in affordable housing, taking the government's total affordable housing budget to almost £9 billion.
That's a bit more money for council and social housing, and...
Next week, this government will publish a draft bill to put a price cap on energy bills.
She was trying to persuade all of us that she's deadly serious about building a country that works for everyone. If only they'd use stronger glue.
Thank you.
This was a party leader tested in her conference speech like none I can remember. By a frog in her throat, by a prankster, most of all by colleagues who doubted whether she was up to the job. As you can see, she has won the confidence of this hall to stay in office, but for who knows how much longer. Phew. It's all over now. Robert Peston, ITV News in Manchester.
And our political correspondent, Romilly Weeks, is live in Manchester. Romilly, this was meant to be a moment for the Prime Minister to reassert herself. Is it all over?
Well, Alistair, I think the overriding feeling in the hall certainly was sympathy for her predicament. There was a real sense of the audience willing her on, trying to cover her splutterings with applause. And the Cabinet certainly made sure they made loyal enough noises afterwards. Her official account released this picture of her speech with cough sweets next to it, trying to make light of the whole thing. But pity is not a sentiment any Prime Minister wants to engender. Even before all this, her party was rattled by Jeremy Corbyn's popularity. It has been striking, talking to party members before the speech this week, how little appetite there was for any change at the top. But those after her job are certainly circling now. We hear that MPs are being canvassed for their opinions of the speech. One MP has loyally tweeted, "There is no vacancy at number 10." But this is certainly a dangerous moment for the Prime Minister.
Romilly, thank you.
It was billed as renewing the British dream, but Theresa May had a nightmarish time delivering her speech to the Conservative Conference in Manchester. Her aim was to re-energise her party after the disastrous election campaign. Her message was that the Conservative government would make the country fairer and more prosperous for a new generation. But all of that was overshadowed by a triple whammy of a comedy interruption by a man bearing a P45, a series of coughing fits, and finally the disintegration of the slogan on the wall behind her. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has this report.
The snap election she called was supposed to have crushed Labour and made her invincible. Even before a stunt and a bad cold hit Theresa May, she already had a job on her hands here, trying to take on a Labour Party boosted by the election and saying sorry to a party she led backwards.
But we did not get the victory we wanted because our national campaign fell short. It was too scripted, too presidential, and it allowed the Labour Party to paint us as the voice of continuity when the public wanted to hear a message of change. I hold my hands up for that. I take responsibility. I led the campaign, and I am sorry.
She spoke of her sense of duty and her personal political mission.
And when people ask me why I put myself through it, the long hours, the pressure, the criticism, the insults that inevitably go with this job, I tell them this: I do it to root out injustice and to give everyone in our country a voice.
Despite a heavy cold, her voice had been holding out until now. Maybe this stunt by a comedian who got himself accredited to the conference set things back. He presented her with a P45 and pretended the Foreign Secretary had put him up to it.
Boris, ask me to give it to her. Boris, job done there.
The Cabinet look on disbelievingly. Security appears to be non-existent.
Good job. That was done. It went to plan. Thank you. Good stuff. Good stuff, Boris.
Stupid stuff. Boris Johnson and David Davis mutter insults at the man.
Keep going, Theresa.
And then join in a standing ovation to help Theresa May get over the interruption.
Shall we... I was about to talk about somebody I'd like to give a P45 to, and that's Jeremy Corbyn.
She had been talking about the free market, the foundation, she said, for the British dream. But it was a speech that will be remembered as a nightmare.
10 years after Northern Rock, our economy is back on track. The deficit is back to pre-crisis levels. Sounds as if my voice isn't on track.
There were moments when it felt like she might not finish the speech. Cabinet concern was mounting. A member of the audience passed a cough sweet to the Chancellor. Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, says give her time to colleagues and encourages a standing ovation.
Thank you. I hope you notice that, ladies and gentlemen, the Chancellor giving something away free.
But how much was he giving away in policy announcements?
And today, I can announce that we will invest an additional £2 billion in affordable housing, taking the government's total affordable housing budget to almost £9 billion. We will...
She said it proved the party had listened and learnt from the general election result. But aides said the new money was enough for only 24,000 new affordable homes over the next 4 years. Then Theresa May revived her election campaign attack on what she called the broken energy market.
Next week, this government will publish a draft bill to put a price cap on energy bills, meeting our manifesto promise and bring an end to rip-off energy prices once and for all.
But it turned out the promise to publish a bill wasn't a cast-iron promise to put it into law. Aides said Ofgem, the regulator, could yet come up with a solution that makes that unnecessary. Just when it seemed nothing else could go wrong, letters started falling off the stage set behind her.
That was shared around the globe. The test of a leader is how you respond when tough times come upon you. When faced... When faced with challenge, if you emerge stronger. When confronted with adversity, if you find the will to pull through. Let us fulfil our duty to the British people. Let us fulfil our duty to our country. Let us fulfil our duty to Britain. And let us renew the British dream. Thank you.
Tory focus groups suggested voters believe her strength is a sense of duty, sticking with the job. Today's outing has already stirred some critics, hoping to prize her from that job. A hug from her husband seemed to release some bottled-up emotion. You did so brilliantly, he told her. Battled through, battled through. Behind her, all the letters from the backdrop were already being swept up. The number 10 team tweeted a light-hearted image. It can't have matched their mood. This was meant to be a moment to reassert her authority. But there have already been contacts buzzing between MPs who want her gone. Tensions on Brexit, barely mentioned in her speech, are very live. And even aides complain that her policy offering is still too thin.
One person who works closely with Theresa May said to me, one of the problems with this government is that when you're trying to get policy together, they were talking about domestic policy, but I think they were also alluding to Europe. As they put it, Boris thinks you can do anything. Phil, a reference to Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, thinks you can do nothing. This day started, remember, with 3 MPs calling for the Foreign Secretary to resign. Not exactly an auspicious opening. It ends with some people muttering in Tory parliamentary circles that the time has come for Theresa May to go. And one person who works closely with Theresa May said to me that if she is having a bit of a low, and I wouldn't be surprised, the argument people will be making to her is, without you, the party falls apart. You just have to listen to those words to realise just what a chronic week this has been for the Tories.
Gary Gibbon. Well, now the Conservative MP Nadhim Zahawi joins us now from Westminster. Nadhim Zahawi, how would you characterise this conference?
It's a coming together of the Conservative family and the Theresa May's focus, laser-like focus on making life better for those who are barely managing. And the reason I say that to you, John, is because for the first time since Harold Macmillan, the Conservative government will be building council houses again. I spoke about this at conference at one of the fringe meetings, and it's a policy that I think one of the people in the audience from Shelter said, well, aren't the Conservatives uncomfortable with this? We're very comfortable with it, and I think the reason Labour on Twitter tonight is focusing on things like Theresa's cough and this prankster are because they will worry about the Conservative Party being so determined to build council houses when it took them 13 years in office, they didn't build a single council house.
Well, shall we just look at the council house? Because we're talking about 5,000 of them. She's promised 130,000 right-to-buy houses. Now, that surely depicts a situation in which, with 100,000 houses needed every year, it's a drop in the bucket.
Well, it's 25,000 over 4 or 5 years. Is this the
5,000 a year?
5,000 a year, which you quite rightly pointed out. The real issue here is we've got to get back to building council housings, and I think the importance of this policy is to make sure we get councils doing it, and as I'm sure. As we succeed, because this is an investment, so it goes on the side of the balance sheet that is an asset, whereas Jeremy Corbyn just wants to spend money which is not recoverable.
But you know the way to get that done. The way to get that done is to allow councils to borrow money against their properties that they already own in order to build council houses. That is something that the government will not do.
Well, there are many ways of doing it. One way of doing it is to councils hold a lot of land, and maybe rather than getting the highest possible value for the land that the Treasury requires, you could look at them partnering with construction companies to build more. The point here, John, though, is that we're going to be making a real determined effort to build more council housing. And if this policy works, I guarantee you it'll be followed through with more and more council houses. Labour will be worrying about this tonight, and that's why they want to focus on the tittle-tattle and all the sort of the stuff this comedian did in the hall.
You may be speculating about what Labour is worrying about tonight, but what perhaps people will want to know is what the Tories are worrying about tonight, and are they worrying about who is actually going to lead them? I mean, Boris Johnson has made no secret of the fact this week that he has interests. So what's to happen?
Well, that's you are now speculating about what Boris thought. I thought he delivered a great speech yesterday at conference, as did David Davis and Liam Fox. Amber Rudd delivered a great speech. The whole of the cabinet is united behind the Prime Minister's Florence speech on the EU. They are united, as you saw today, behind her because our Prime Minister is gritty, is determined, and will get a good deal for Britain.
But there is a problem, isn't there? Because Boris Johnson makes speeches that perhaps don't get reported quite as much. But before the whole conference, he issued those 4 points, those 4 red lines in the Sun newspaper. And yesterday, he made that extraordinary comment about clearing bodies out of Libya before you could do business there. This is clearing bodies off the beach. I mean, what a sordid and revolting thing to talk about.
Right, well, let's deal with both of your points. One, he actually never used the word red lines in that interview. You're now attributing to them, which I think is unfair, John, and it's unlike you to be unfair to any politician. And the second point...
very odd that the whole conference has talked about Boris's red lines.
Well, he made, as I said, a great speech yesterday to conference, complimenting what David Davis was saying.
And what about the bodies?
Well, look, his language may have not been ideal, but there were Daesh terrorists who are, their bodies are all over the beaches in Sirte that need to be dealt with, and because of the IEDs, because of the mines, it's difficult to deal with them. He was making that point. May it be, he could have chosen better words, no doubt, but it's no big. This is not the issue here,
right,
John. And my concern is people who are sort of wanting to find splits where there aren't splits are sort of looking at what Boris is saying about these things and making an issue of them. The reality is, this government's united. We will deliver for those people.
If so, can Mrs May carry on? And if so, for how long?
Of course she can carry on. She should carry on to the next election. I'll tell you for why, John, because when she gets a good deal from our European partners, the whole narrative will change. It'll be Theresa, the gritty, the determined politician. In the way she was a Home Secretary when she got rid of Abu Qatada and Abu Hamza, she will do the same thing. Theresa May is focused on the job and she will deliver for Britain. And then the narrative
because
will
she's
shift.
done so, she will lead your party into the next election.
Yes, and you will have me on this programme, and I will remind you of this interview when you said, well, can she really last? I would say, well, remember those words, John. You will eat your words.
Nadim Sahawi, we'll hold you to that. We'll be there then. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Well, amid the mishaps of the Prime Minister's speech, her promises to end rip-off energy prices and fix our broken housing market were rather overshadowed. But both policies faced immediate criticism in some quarters for lacking substance. Our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, is here to explain what's going on.
Well, this was not a return to the halcyon days of council house building that you saw in the Macmillan government in the 1950s. And that's despite the fact that many senior ministers at party conference openly acknowledged the fact that housing is the issue that's slipping away from them. After all, home ownership is one of the key propositions of the Tory party. And if more and more young people feel like they're never even going to get on the housing ladder, well, what kind of a stake would they have in a conservative economy? It follows that there's very little to conserve. And certainly today, local authorities were hoping for more freedom to be able to borrow more money and build more houses. And while the £2 billion was welcome, it certainly wasn't the game-changer move that people were expecting.
And how much more substantial is the energy prices cap? I mean, something Ed Miliband is claiming was his.
Well, indeed, just 4 years ago, when Ed Miliband came up with the policy, David Cameron described it as Marxist. And certainly critics today would say its revival is socialism light. But for many consumers out there, energy prices is a really important issue. And if we look at the figures, you can see that 15 million households in the UK who are loyal to their energy supplier end up being on what's called the standard variable tariff. Now, on average, they'll pay more than £1,000 a year in bill. And here's the problem, because if they switch to the cheapest tariff, they could save £300 or more. That's the obvious attraction of this policy and going after these 6 big energy firms. And they got hammered in the stock market. But there was a warning from consumer groups that while popular, this energy price cap might actually lessen consumer choice rather than help it.
Helia, thank you. Well, our main story tonight, Theresa May hoped to rally her party with her speech at the close of the Conservative conference. But her policy announcements were overshadowed by a comedy interruption from a man bearing a P45 and a prolonged series of coughing fits from the Prime Minister herself.
So, why we will never... Oh, excuse me. Thank you.
Well, I'm joined now by the Spectator journalist Katie Balls, who's just back from the Conservative Party conference, and the Times columnist Philip Collins, who was chief speechwriter for Tony Blair and who has just written a book on the best political speeches. Was this one of them?
Well, no, I don't think it's one of the best. I mean, maybe one of the most memorable. I mean, it certainly shows that these political speeches matter, which for those of us flogging books on political speeches is great news. It will be memorable, even though it wasn't great. I mean, it was
just for the coughing, or just for
for the whole thing. I mean, you had the comedy interruption, you had the coughing, then you had the set falling apart, like an episode of Acorn Antiques. It was a sort of script by Ed Miliband, delivered by Ian Duncan Smith, that had all the impact of Neil Kinnock falling into the sea. It was a total disaster.
Casey Balls?
Yeah, it was a bit of a comedy of errors, really. It just went completely wrong for her.
But did you feel sorry for her?
I think the whole conference felt very sorry for her, even May's own critics. And I think in the hall, everyone was just really willing of her to get to the end of the speech. And there are times when it didn't seem like she would be able to.
I mean, can you remember a worse Conservative leader speech?
Oh, yeah, I can. Yeah, plenty. Oh, yeah. You got to remember that the reason that she's still there as Prime Minister is that there's nobody else. And then one of the contenders, David Davis, in 2005, if you recall, gave a really terrible wooden speech, which was worse in the sense that he actually got through it without coughing. I mean, the actual content of Theresa May's speech was standard conference rhetoric. It was fine. Just the delivery was so awful. I think Ian Duncan Smith's speech was arguably worse as well. So I wouldn't say this is the worst one, no.
Will anybody remember anything she actually said, though?
I don't think particularly. I think the coughing will be the most memorable thing, but what works in her favour is these are things like Phil said. It's not really her fault. She had a cough. Maybe she shouldn't have done an hour-long speech with that in mind, but she did. And I think the policy announcements, in a way, because they're quite lacklustre, it means that we're not focusing on them as much.
So what will be happening? I mean, she looked pretty depressed as she walked off towards the edge. You know, she didn't go over and glad hand people along the line, which is what they normally do. It's all kisses and hugs and well done. She was kind of, you know, explaining her throat was awful and not going near people. Do you think they are propping her up in Downing Street tonight, saying it wasn't that bad, you can't quit?
Well, I think there'll be a battle for the sort of metaphor of this speech. What does it show that she's resolute and steely in adversity, or does it show that she literally can't say anything? And it depends how it plays out. You've got to remember she is there simply because there's nobody else. She's been sort of weak and stable ever since the general election. And that's still true. The question is whether she still has the appetite to do it. She did look terrible. It was awful to have to go through it. For everybody watching, it was excruciating. But imagine what it's like to have to do that when your voice gives out. It was really awful. So it depends a lot on her, I think, now.
But she did talk about it in her speech. She said, you know, people ask me why I put myself through this. And probably at the end of the speech, she was asking herself for a second time. I think they're going to try and show, like Phil says, that this is an endurance thing. And if she can get through that speech, which was very painful for everyone, including herself, she can get through other things.
But I mean, we know how depressed she was after the election result and the tears and all of that. You would imagine there's something similar going on tonight.
Yeah, but I think she knows it's a horrible job she has ahead of her. She knows she has a very difficult situation. But as she said to her party, the Backbench Committee, quite soon after the result, she got them into this mess and she'll get them out of it. And I think she's quite stoic in that. We saw also a glimpse of humour from her today after the speech, when I think they tweeted from her Twitter account a picture of all the cough medicine she's taking and with the notion cough. And I think that's probably how she's handling it. Do you think that was good? I think her using humour is a good thing.
I don't know what you can do after that. You've got to try and salvage it. But there were a lot of people in Manchester already talking about when they should move to a succession and who it should be. So that conversation will intensify, there's no question. I mean, if this does anything for her position, it will weaken it. There's no doubt about it, because it just is, when you have a Prime Minister having a public disaster of that kind, it can't do anything other than weaken her. And so it might accelerate the process, but there is still a fundamental problem. They don't know who to replace her with.
And Katie, I mean, if she were to say, right, that's it, I've had enough, I'm going, who, other than Boris Johnson, has emerged as a contender?
Well, I think you have the same cabinet favourites. We know that Amber Rudd, we think, is interested in this, as is David Davis. The problem is there's so much disagreement. And actually, from being at the Conservative Party conference, I was really struck by how half-empty the main hall was most of the time. It was on the fringes that you got the queues, and they were for Ruth Davidson and Jacob Rees-Mogg.
So that they are the future?
I don't know if they're necessarily the future, but I think it shows that the cabinet doesn't have the answers.
I mean, if they are the future, what's Labour going to be thinking?
Well, it depends who they went for. I mean, I think if the Tories panicked in the wake of Jeremy Corbyn and went for Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think Labour would be delighted, and I think they'd be right to be delighted. Ruth Davidson is an entirely different proposition, though. She really is quite interesting, and I think if they were to enlist Ruth Davidson and force her to come down to England and be Prime Minister, a very strange thing to have to force someone to do, then I think politics would change.
Phil Collins and Katie Balls, thank you both very much.
Hello. This was billed as the speech to rescue her premiership, but in the event, Theresa May had a horrible end to a difficult party conference. Now, I promise we will talk about what she actually said a bit later, but the drama of the day was in one man's prank, one woman's coughing and two badly fastened letters. In a funny way, it did expose the human side of politics. It was hard not to feel for Theresa May as a person. The mishaps also made one of her key points for her, that she is someone who battles on in the face of adversity. And it was also poignant to see the cabinet, led, I think, by Amber Rudd and Philip Hammond, give her a standing ovation at a vulnerable point to help her find time to catch her voice. But, all that being said, what Theresa May needs is respect and authority to clasp a demoralised and divided party and lead it somewhere. This won't have helped. Here's our political editor, Nick Watt.
Sometimes I feel like throw my hands up in the air.
Sometimes things just go wrong no matter what you do. A speech designed to revive a premiership through a new British dream turned into a politician's worst nightmare. It all started so well as Theresa May spoke of the personal political journey that brought her all the way to number 10. And then she apologised for the election.
We did not get the victory we wanted because our national campaign fell short. It was too scripted, too presidential, and it allowed the Labour Party to paint us as the voice of continuity when the public wanted to hear a message of change. I hold my hands up for that. I take responsibility. I led the campaign, and I am sorry.
Theresa May was approaching the halfway point when there were the first signs that all was not quite normal. Cabinet ministers eyed the scene warily as the prankster Simon Brodkin hoved into view and handed over a fake P45 to Theresa May.
Boris, job done there. Given her the P45.
The Prime Minister, who is conscious of her own security, appeared briefly startled. After a lengthy pause, she managed a joke.
I was about to talk about somebody I'd like to give a P45 to, and that's Jeremy Corbyn.
Theresa May recovered her stride to press on with her signature announcements on housing and an energy cap, only to struggle with a coughing fit. The conference rallied to the Prime Minister, but some members of the audience needed a little encouragement. Luckily, an old university friend was on hand. Bad luck, of course, comes in threes. So in the final indignity, the lettering of the conference slogan started to fall off the wall. The Prime Minister rediscovered her voice at the end and was comforted by the man she calls her rock.
So genuine warmth and affection for Theresa May there at the end of one of the most extraordinary conference speeches by any British Prime Minister. For the first time, this conference saw a more natural Theresa May as she ad-libbed her way through the heckler and persevered with that croak in her voice. The warmth in this hall may well save her premiership, but that will depend on whether this party is feeling love or pity for their Prime Minister.
Love, 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 love. Not pity. We don't. The Conservative Party doesn't do pity. Like, if you're being pitied, then you'd have been gone before ever getting to that sort of stage. No, it was definitely love. We like to see people who beat the odds. That's what gets us going. You know, people who just defy whatever obstacles are in their path.
If you want a metaphor for a Prime Minister and a leader who can fight through difficulties, that speech was the perfect metaphor.
You could really feel huge warmth from the hall. You know, it was difficult in terms of her cough, but, you know, the hall really showed their support for her.
I thought it was a very well thought out speech. Obviously, she was disrupted, held herself very well and continued with her theme, so I thought that was very good.
There was also admiration amongst party members.
And of course, when you're in her position, the minute you get a tickle, you think, oh my God, you know. So, no, I thought she did really, really well.
Others were less effusive about the Prime Minister's leadership.
I feel it's adequate. Yeah? I won't say stirring. I was asked yesterday by Reuters what I thought about Boris's speech, and I think that is stirring and uplifting with little detail.
Are you prepared?
Theresa May now joins a long list of politicians humbled whilst the cameras are rolling. The lucky ones brush it off.
I've got my answer. I've got my answer.
The unlucky ones never recover from an image that symbolises their weakness.
So this was a dreadful end to a difficult week for Theresa May. Good generals need luck, and this Prime Minister seems perennially unable to lay her hands on that prized political gift. Friends of the Prime Minister told me that she handled her bad luck today with skill and showed some rare, unscripted humour. But the vultures in the Conservative Party are beginning to circle in the hope that her misfortune will provide their chance to pounce.
The Prime Minister managed to find the light side to her conference cold, tweeting this picture. But at the most excruciating moment of the day, her cabinet colleagues could not hide their pain.
Oh, Nick is with me, hot-footing it back from Manchester. We said this is the big speech, the sort of make or break one, Nick. And what are we all talking about? Survivability stakes. What's the sort of changing odds tonight?
Well, you saw in my piece, sir, that there's strong cabinet support for the Prime Minister, but this afternoon conversations have been underway amongst critics of Theresa May, amongst Conservative MPs. Now, there's a feeling of sympathy for her, not a great sentiment for a Prime Minister, but the thinking is that she needed a barnstorming speech today to revive her premiership, and obviously that did not happen. And I have to say, I sense a movement of opinion amongst Conservative MP. The consensus until now has been that she has until the end of Brexit, she has until 2019. But there is now some movement, not necessarily decisive movement yet, some movement to she will need to think about going sooner than that. One former cabinet minister said to me the Prime Minister is now in a danger zone and there's a window of opportunity for her to go between now and Christmas, because the EU negotiations don't get into the free trade deal area until after that. Now, I spoke to one former cabinet minister at the beginning of this week, and this person said to me, this Prime Minister is 2 disasters away from leaving Downing Street. This former cabinet minister said to me this evening, 1 down, the next disaster will finish her off. But what I think we are possibly talking about is the so-called men in grey suits. We're not talking about those formal letters to the 1922 chair, Graham Brady. We are talking about possibly, at some point, a private delegation visiting the Prime Minister and saying, think about it.
Briefly, Nick, security. So a guy gets in, stands at the front, gets very close to her with an unwelcome piece of paper. What are they saying about that?
Well, the Home Secretary said an inquiry is underway, but there is real cabinet anger over what they regard as the failure of the Prime Minister's close protection team, the bodyguards, to protect her. What they say is their most important weapon are their eyes. They should anticipate, and there was lots of sort of notice of what this prankster was up to. Nothing happened, and these cabinet ministers saying they were sort of looking at each other and almost with their eyes saying to each other, well, do we need to go and rescue the Prime Minister?
Nick, thank you very much. Well, poor Theresa May could have done with a Hamlet cigar and the appropriate music to play at the end of her speech. But it makes an interesting question, though, as to what kind of politicians we want and respect. We don't warm to robotic ones, we don't always like the slick ones, but do we have the right kind of tolerance for those who suffer the odd indignity? Well, I'm joined now by the Times columnist Jenny Russell, the LBC presenter Ian Dale, but let me start with Margot James, who is a minister in the business department. Very good evening to you.
Good evening.
Which row were you in?
I was about 10 rows back.
Right. And,
yes.
And what were your feelings as you sort of watched this unfold?
Well, I was inspired by the speech, for a start. I certainly don't recognise the narrative that has been building up in the short introduction to this programme at all. I found it inspiring. I felt that she reset the direction for the party, and I was very pleased. But obviously, I mean, things...
It didn't go to plan.
No, clearly not, in a number of ways. I mean, I really felt for her over this loss of voice. I knew before the speech that she had a bad cold.
Did she have a bad cold? Because often a sort of nervousness or tension causes a throat tightening that can cause that.
Oh, no, she was not well. Right. I think it's probably laryngitis, actually, from what I heard. But I knew before, because I was speaking to her PPS, George Hollingbury, and he said, well, she's got a really bad cold, but, you know, she's really up for it. And you know, health problems like that, at a time like that, just a ghastly feeling. And
you didn't recognise the narrative we imposed at the top of the programme. I want to ask these two whether they recognise it, because the papers tomorrow are certainly going with the narrative of farce and disaster. Jenny, what was your feeling when you saw it?
Yes, I'm afraid that is all that one will remember. I'm really
brave effort. Yeah.
Brave effort by Margot to say she thought it was an inspiring speech. The fact was, it was impossible to take the speech in while she was talking, because you were just thunderstruck by what was happening. Now and then you caught a paragraph or two, and then you did get caught up in the narrative of extreme sympathy and horror about the whole thing.
Yeah. Ian, do you think I mean, everybody's saying today, you don't want a politician doesn't want pity, that's a disaster. Yeah. Is that true? Or actually, do you think maybe a politician with a bit of pity is a bit of...
quite a few of my non-political friends over the last few weeks have said, I feel really sorry for Theresa May. And I'm thinking, well, that's not a particularly great place to be for any politician when someone feels sorry for them. And I think today that's been exacerbated. However, I did 3 hours on this on my radio show this afternoon, as you might imagine. The first hour, we just concentrated on the disasters, and there were quite a few calls, but nothing sort of out of the ordinary. The second 2 hours, we concentrated on the energy cap and housing, and I said, if you want to phone in about what's happened before, please do. 3 calls over those 2 hours. And if you looked at the texts and tweets that were coming in, they were sort of 50-50. The usual suspects would say, oh, weaken Prime Minister, weaken authority, and all the rest of it. But in the end, does the fact that she had a cough, and she was genuinely ill, she was on my colleague Nick Ferrari's programme yesterday, and he noticed that, and he said to her, have you got a cold? And she said yes. Does having a cough mean that she's any more weak today than she was yesterday? Now, of course, the papers are going to say yes, and I completely understand that. But if Tory MPs think that the way to get through this now is to depose Theresa May, they should be very careful what they wish for.
But it is, Jenny, very difficult if you're trying to establish authority, to have a room full of people feeling absolutely desperately sorry for her and yearning for you to get to the end of your speech.
I think that is a problem, but I think that Ian is right in the sense that the whole reason that Theresa May is in office is that nobody is able to agree on who should replace her, and that fact hasn't changed. Anyone else who wants to take over is in a very weakened position themselves. Boris Johnson has done himself an enormous disservice. Ruth Davidson is in Scotland. Amber Rudd can't take the job at the moment because she's a Remainer. And really that probably only leaves David Davis as somebody who might be able to step into the breach. And what the Tories cannot afford to do at the moment, and they know it, is they've already wasted an enormous amount of the Brexit time with a general election. If they now have a leadership election...
We're halfway through.
Then exactly. So unless they can find a candidate who everyone agrees on and will put in without having a leadership election...
I want to go back to
very dangerous.
Just on that, Nick Watt was absolutely right. There are Conservative backbenchers who are sort of machinating today. There is one former Cabinet Minister who I'm reliably informed is going round collecting signatures to give to Graham Brady. Now, what will the consequence of that be? Yet more disunity. Nobody votes for a disunited party. You've got cabinet ministers acting like self-indulgent. Can I use the word shits on Newsnight?
No.
But they are. That's what they are. They are being totally disloyal, and they are going to affect the Conservatives' long-term chances if they carry on with it.
Margot James, do you recognise plots, names going around, a little bit of texting and WhatsApp groups talking to each other about Theresa May's leadership?
That sort of thing is, you know, rife in politics. Ian mentions ex-cabinet minister. I have no idea who Ian's talking about, but there are some ex-cabinet ministers or ex-ministers who are extremely embittered individuals who just want to get their own back on the fact that they don't feel recognised. And, you know, life is full of that. You have to move on. You have to keep going and disregard it. And that would be my advice to the Prime Minister. I think what people saw today was a much more human side of the PM.
I think
absolutely right. And I think people did sympathise with her, but not in a pitying sense. I don't think that actually the problems, I would sort of take issue with what Jenny said, because I don't think the problems obliterated the speech, certainly for those of us who were listening to it. I mean, she was halfway through the speech before any of the problems happened anyway.
I want you all to stay there, because we want to talk about the policy, which I think is the substance of the speech, which we need to get to. In broad direction, Theresa May is tilting away from laissez-faire conservatism. Theresa May is not aping Jeremy Corbyn, but maybe she is mimicking Ed Miliband's Labour policies somewhat. Her new policies were in areas where Labour's making the running: student fees, housing and energy prices. So, will that shore up Tory votes, or simply validate people thinking they might want to switch to the real Labour? It's a little bit reminiscent of the 70s Labour government. Back in 1976, Prime Minister Jim Callaghan made a hugely important party conference speech, yielding somewhat to the Thatcherite economic argument.
It's an absolute fact of life which no government, be it left or right, can alter. We used to think that you could spend your way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you in all candour that that option no longer exists.
Now that was a really important moment.
The Conservative Party has a problem with one large group of people. Voters born since Ted Heath lived in Downing Street. Labour's well ahead with younger people.
We'll discuss whether that's a Tory fate soon, but for more detail on the specifics of policy today, here's Chris Cook.
The Conservative Party has a problem with one large group of people. Voters born since Ted Heath lived in Downing Street. Labour's well ahead with younger people, even those at the start of middle age. The Tories' narrow win in the last election was based on their success with older Britons. There are big, specific issues facing younger people, and this week the Tories devoted some time to them, but it wasn't wholly convincing. Take housing. In 1991, 2/3, 66% of 25 to 34-year-olds owned a home. Now it's just 42%. That's what happens when you get high house prices and stagnant wages. The announcement today sounds big, an attempt to deal with that.
I can announce that we will invest an additional £2 billion in affordable housing, taking the government's total affordable housing budget to almost £9 billion.
But it's about 5,000 new affordable homes a year. And Labour's manifesto pledges the equivalent of 70,000 extra affordable homes a year by the end of the Parliament. They're nowhere close.
But a decent home is a right for everyone, whatever their income or whatever their background.
What about student debt? The average debt for an English undergraduate is £32,200. Much of that's down to the fees. In fee-free Scotland, it's £11,700. The government's response has been to change the English loan repayment terms. The point at which repayment starts will move from when graduates earn £21,000 a year to £25,000. That small-sounding tweak will cost £2.3 billion a year in the long run, as it means average graduates will repay £10,000 less of their debt. So that's serious money, a real commitment. But again, Jeremy Corbyn just goes much, much further.
If we want to remove university tuition fees, and we do, so our students are not saddled with debt, and restore maintenance grants so that all children, whatever their background, have a chance of going to university, that will cost £11 billion. I think that is money well spent.
So it's hard to see this, or other bits like a cap on energy prices, as solving the Tory age problem, especially as they made things worse for younger voters with more money for Help to Buy, a scheme propping up house prices. The party is largely standing by its 2017 manifesto, and we know what young people thought of that.
Chris Cook there, we liked it so much we started playing it twice. Margot James, Ian Dale and Jenny Russell are still with me. And let me start with you, Margot, because you're a minister. It is funny that all the policy areas in which there were announcements were basically ones in which Jeremy Corbyn's making running. In the ones Jeremy Corbyn doesn't talk about, like social care, there was no announcement. Isn't that weird?
No, I think we had the energy price cap in our manifesto at the last election, and something that Theresa May made clear she wanted to challenge when she first became Prime Minister as well. So I don't think that was necessarily
but it was in the Queen's
response.
speech, it was dropped and it's come back again.
Yeah, it has come back again. That's because we are in the process of trying to get Ofgem, the regulator, to be more assertive in their dealings with the big six energy companies. And at the moment, they've indicated they would need some government action in order to drive this policy home. Right. So we're in the process of
so
trying
it's on,
to
it's
achieve
off,
that.
it's on again. But look, I suppose the question is, why didn't you do this before? Didn't you know there was a problem before? I mean, you say it was in the manifesto. It wasn't in the 2015 manifesto. For the Conservatives to go to the nation with a bunch of Labour-like policies merely reminds everybody that you haven't been building enough council homes for the last 10 years. You haven't been controlling energy prices.
No government
and you've been letting students get into too much
I'm sorry,
debt.
no government has been building enough council houses, and you can go back 3 decades. There's no government that's been building enough. It's been a problem. I think it's worth noting that in her speech, the PM said that she was going to hold herself personally accountable for solving this dreadful housing problem, the housing shortage that, you know, has dogged the country for at least 25 years.
How many houses did she announce that the 2 billion, how many is it going to build?
It's going to build 25,000 over a 3-year period, because we're already part-way through the spending period from 2016 to 2021.
So 8,000 houses is your big announcement
it's not
on
only
housing.
That. It's not only that. We're also committing £10 billion more to the Help to Buy scheme, which has already helped a lot of young people.
But that just pushes house prices up, so it sort of helps them get the money, but it also
helps young people who can afford to pay the mortgage interest but can't afford the whole deposit. That's what it does, and it's already helped a lot of people to buy their new home, and so that is a help too. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were not further announcements over the next 12 months.
Do you recognise,
as I said, she's going to personally drive this housing solution through.
All week, those of us who were at the Tory Party conference just heard everyone talking about Jeremy Corbyn, criticising Jeremy Corbyn, and then validating all the concerns that he has expressed by adopting policies that try and deal, rather modestly compared to his more lavish plans, try and deal with the very things he's identified.
We're not going to get into an auction with Jeremy Corbyn over these policy areas. His policy proposals are completely irresponsible and completely undeliverable. And also, in the case of student fees, wrong in the opinion of most economists. And I wouldn't be surprised if you would agree with them, Mevan. You know very well that the abolition of tuition fees altogether, as proposed by Corbyn, is going to help very much disproportionately middle-class, well-educated people, most of whom have been to independent schools. That's the people who are going to benefit from Jeremy Corbyn's policy.
Let me open it up to the other two. How would the speech have gone down, Jenny, if there hadn't been the distractions? Just imagine it had gone really smoothly, those words. How would it have gone down?
I think it would have appealed to some people at the margins who are fairly well off and might think of voting Conservative. But its key problem is that it's not doing anything to address the major concerns of people under the age of 40 or so who don't earn above average wages. Because what's happened over the past 10 years is that since the financial crash, real wages haven't risen. People are sick of austerity. And what they see is an economy which is completely skewed against them. You can't buy a house if you're a young person unless you've got rich parents. The jobs that have got progression and decent wages are very hard to find, and you're saddled with absolutely staggering amounts of student debt which are going to hang around your neck for the rest of your life. And if you want a decent life with opportunities, then Jeremy Corbyn is saying, I'll transform the economy and you will get the chances that the generation had before.
It hinges on whether you believe him.
This is just incremental. Of course
you have to believe him.
It may be disastrous, but it sounds attractive.
Sounds like he's on your side.
And the Conservatives just fiddling at the edges.
What about you, and did you feel the speech would have gone down well in the absence of the distractions?
I don't actually disagree with a lot of what Jenny said. She might be surprised to hear. I think if you read the speech, there's actually quite a powerful narrative in it. Theresa May explains why she is in politics. She talks a lot about the British dream, which we don't generally use as a phrase in this country. But
isn't it Ed Miliband? Wasn't that Ed Miliband?
It's been a lot of politicians have used that.
Yeah, and Michael Howard had used it, didn't he? Yeah.
I mean, this was... I mean, when you read it, it's not a bad speech, and I think it sets out her course for the next 4 years, if she lasts those 4 years.
But what it's not doing, and this feels like a problem, is there's a lot of sort of anger and irritation out there at inequality, at Grenfell Tower, at the rich 1% walking off with all the money. And it doesn't feel to channel or articulate the anger. It's basically Theresa May struggling to be the change candidate.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I think in certain sections it did, but that's all been lost today. Let's just recognise that. Though somebody said never waste a crisis. There are always opportunities that come in a crisis, and there is actually a big opportunity here for Theresa May. If she embraces this in some way, if she shows in the next interview that she does, how she felt. What did she feel when she was standing there, when this guy approached her? Did she think he was a terrorist in some way. She stood there quite resolutely and didn't flinch like I suspect the rest of us would have done, and she kept going with the cough. Now, you can learn a lot about a politician when they face adversity, and when I say adversity, obviously you don't compare that with the way people are having to live in some communities in this country. But I think we did learn something about her today, and it wasn't entirely negative.
No, I completely agree with what Ian's just said. She was calm under fire, wasn't she? I mean, all these things happening to her. She finished that speech. I thought in the middle of it that she would, when she was praising entrepreneurs and talking about wealth creators and how we value them, at that point, when she began to cough, she could have stopped because it had reached a sort of natural break in the speech. And I thought she might stop there. I thought she was incredibly brave to go on.
And when I know somebody who's seen her in operation in Cobra, and they say she is the sort of personality you want in charge in those kind of situations. She asks all the right questions and comes up with a solution.
Last word, Jenny.
I think a huge amount will depend on whether she still has the hunger to keep going, because this is a toxic task at the moment to get through Brexit, and a lot of the other politicians in the party will be very happy to let her keep going if she can get to the end, if they think she can deliver the version of Brexit which they happen to want. So if she wants it, she may be able to hang on to it.
I agree again.
Funny that we went back to the distractions. I was trying to keep it on policy, but you started talking about the coughing, not me. Thank you all very much. Thanks, Margaret.
Evening. Let's take a look then at what's on the front pages of the papers. And the Metro reflects on the bizarre events during the Prime Minister's speech as a comedian clutching a P45 interrupted her and the signage behind her began to fall down. The FT also leads with a photo of Mrs May mid-cough with her would-be leadership rivals looking on. Last gasp is the headline from The Eye, which says the speech raises further questions about her future in number 10. The Guardian is no less harsh. It says coughing and spluttering Theresa May's dream turned into a nightmare. The Express, however, strikes a more supportive tone, urging readers to trust Theresa's fighting spirit. The Star says the Tories are in chaos after the Prime Minister was caught at the centre of the stunt. The Telegraph strikes a similar tone after Theresa May's tragic farce, with the paper saying her political future is hanging in the balance. Meanwhile, the Sun takes a swipe at the falling signage during a nightmare speech. Tory MPs have warned Theresa May's premiership is one crisis from the exit after her speech in Manchester, which was designed to settle the leadership question. A victory for organ donors is the front page for the Mirror, with an opt-out law to be introduced, expected to save 500 lives a year. And while the Daily Mail is dominated by the photograph of the P45, it also headlines opting out of donating organs. So let's chat through those front pages and some of the inside coverage as well with Andrew Pearce and Kevin Maguire. So quite a choice there of front pages on the subject of Theresa May's to pick. You've started though with The Eye, which just uses two words, last gasp.
Yeah, it makes her sound like a smoker, but yeah, she did cough without it. It was Mayday, Mayday. What a terrible week she's had, capped off by the mother of all bad performances. Her luck has run out, but her conference has been hijacked by Boris Johnson. She'd been overshadowed all week. He presented himself as a lion gonna roar. She was a squeaky mouse. And it wasn't just the prankster with a P45, it wasn't just the coughing, it wasn't even just the letters falling off the set. It was the fact that it was a pretty shallow speech. It didn't really have any big policy announcements in on housing. It was absolutely pathetic. 5,000 new houses a year, and there's 1.2 million people on waiting lists. It was appalling. Even you will struggle to defend Mayday, Mayday.
I think, actually...
That's it, right? Just stop it there, right?
How untypically uncharitable of Kevin Maguire. I think people feel really sorry for this woman. It could happen to anybody. Conference cold, conference throat. She bravely soldiered on. Some others might have just given up the ghost. It was bad luck. I mean, who would have thought the intruder would be able to get all the way to the front of the stage? He could have had a knife, a gun.
The intruder didn't nick the letters.
And she carried on. And look, you can't blame the Prime Minister for the fact the signage at the back falls off the stage. She doesn't put the stuff up herself. And she look, she overdid it at this conference because she did 28 interviews and 19 speeches at different fringe events. She overdid it. She should have conserved her voice. I saw her on, I can't remember if it was Monday or Tuesday morning, she was doing the round of interviews, chatted to her, and you could hear then her voice was very throaty. And you could sense in that hall, people were willing her on, desperate for her to succeed, and I thought it was rather touching that the Cabinet all rose to their feet, joining in the standing ovation to give her more time, because they're just thinking there, but for the grace of God, go all of us, really. It could happen to anyone.
She's the Prime Minister. She's not anybody or any woman. She's the Prime Minister. Well, sympathy is for kids that fall over in the playground and graze their knee. Well, it's not a Prime Minister who's got to negotiate Brexit, in charge of the economy, health, education, all these big issues. So it's just not good enough to say, oh, God, isn't it poor Theresa?
Look, no way am I saying this had to be the speech of her life, and it was for all the wrong reasons, of course. It was memorable for all the wrong reasons. But I still think people will be far more sympathetic and compassionate towards her because they would see a woman struggling and really struggling, but she battled on.
I'm more interested in the families that are struggling when she cuts their benefits, brings in universal credit. They can't get houses. That's the people you should worry about struggling. She is the Prime Minister. She's incredibly powerful. She wanted that job. She got the job. She's blown the job. She had the election. She thought she was going to wipe out Labour. She lost her majority, wiped that out instead. She's brought all this upon herself. They say, look, May, she was lucky at the beginning to get the premiership.
But in this speech, the things that went wrong were not her fault. The fact that she was interrupted by a comedian, the fact that she had a cough that she couldn't control, and the fact that the letters fell off the back of it, but none of that was her fault, was it? And the fact that she dealt with some of them with a certain amount of humour, will that make people think she's not the Maybot?
There was a couple of good jokes there, actually. I thought that was very quick when she said about the P45 for Jeremy
Let's not get carried away. If this was Britain's Got Talent, she wouldn't be on next week. She just cracked a couple of awkward lines to try and get her through. That was it.
OK, and these headlines are going to be very unhelpful to her, aren't they? When she's trying to look strong, trying to look like she's the leader that should be in that place.
Frankly, even if she had come up with some really imaginative, radical ideas to kickstart the housing market, we wouldn't be talking about it now, because when have we ever seen this three disasters to befall a Prime Minister, making her the biggest speech of the year, and when she's had so many difficulties. I don't say that Boris Johnson Boris Johnson did what Boris always does. He became the star of the party conference, and she was never going to be able to live up to it. But who would have thought that it would have ended up like this?
It was interesting with the Sun, giving her a hard time there. Omni Shambles play on, be very supportive of her. But they've switched to Boris recently. In fact, the editor has been out jogging with Boris Johnson in Manchester.
Well, they did. They did last year.
They've not spared her at all. You can see the Tory press now moving against Theresa May, who they backed to get the job, but they see her as a loser, and they're looking to the future.
Well, and there's a lot of talk of the future, and I did whiz on to the Times just because there's a suggestion there. They say top team blamed for the farce, and all the while the pressure seems to be being ratcheted up. If we look at the front of the Times, for example, May on final warning after speech shambles. I mean, how much pressure?
Well, there's a small group of MPs, we think, were texting each other saying, what did you think of the speech? Testing the water to see, is there any move for a leadership challenge? They are not going to sack a Prime Minister out because she had a bad cough.
No, that's right.
That is ridiculous.
They will sack her because she lost their majority. She's been utterly incompetent and useless since, doesn't look up to the job, never let her fight another election. And she's taken a week, which is supposed to relaunch her stamp of authority, become a commanding figure, and she's come out even weaker. She's not strong enough to sack Johnson, so he just misbehaves all the time. Although there is, being in Manchester, you'll have picked this up, a lot of resentment against Johnson, a Boris backlash amongst MPs and cabinet ministers over him going so disloyal. But the members didn't.
They love him.
They didn't have the backlash in the same way.
Boris Johnson has sought at the top of the Conservative Home League table of who they want to see as their next party leader. But, of course, to get on the ballot paper, you have to have the support of your MPs, because MPs choose the final two. and not all MPs, it has to be said, were pleased with Boris's tactics. Others said it's about time we had a cabinet minister really talking positively about Brexit, the sunlit uplands, because it is going to be good when we leave the EU.
Yeah.
David Davis thinks so too, and Boris has got the panache and the style to deliver that speech.
And then going around talking about dead bodies in Libya once you get rid of them.
Wasn't well phrased, I admit.
Come on.
Wasn't well phrased.
The bloke's a walking disaster.
No, he's not. No, he's not.
What about the policy in this speech? Because the headlines are all preoccupied with all the misfortune that befell her.
Well,
what about the policies? Kevin Maguire was saying earlier he thought they were thin on the ground. What do you think
I
about
was
the
hoping for something more radical on property, on housing, because look, young people under 35 didn't vote Tory at the last election. They can't get a foot on the property ladder. There wasn't much in that speech today that suggests the government have got a grip of that problem.
There was some money pledged and an appeal to developers.
But it's 5,000 houses a year. That's not enough. What they've got to do is find a way to utilise all that land that's in public ownership and get local authorities building on it. They've got to be incentives. They've got to be tax incentives. They've really got to start motoring on this, and soon.
If you want houses, just give local authorities the money and they'll build council houses. That's the surest way.
Well, the thing is, you always want to print money, Kevin, but we haven't got any money.
Hang on, you've given this old magic money tree a hell of a shake this week.
The sort of money...
Something for students, a little bit for housing.
The sort of...
doing it all the way.
Thousands of houses you'd need tens of billions of pounds from public money, and there simply isn't that sort of money.
But yeah, if you invest in houses and you build them, you won't be paying landlords a fortune through housing benefit. And that's what's happening now. You can put the money into bricks and mortar instead of subsidising private landlords.
Well, and what about the energy cap as well? Because it was an interesting message, wasn't it? On the one hand, she was saying to Jeremy Corbyn's supporters, we should stand up for the free market. It's done an awful lot of good. But at the same time, with the energy cap and even you could say the housing,
I'm not sure it will happen,
because
afterwards there was some suggestion with the briefing that was going on that actually what they really want is the regulator, which is useless and insipid and weak and ineffective, Ofgem, to do its job and sort these companies out, which are operating like a cartel. They're operating unfairly. They are distorting the market, and the Ofgem should put in the price cap.
To be fair,
not the government.
To be fair to May, when she talks about a free market,
you're never fair to May.
I am. I'm the voice of reason and fairness. You will not get anybody more even-handed than me. To be fair to May.
That's got to be tape for posterity.
To be fair to May, when she talks about the free market, she doesn't mean no rules or regulations. She accepts there will be some rules and regulations. The big argument really between the two parties is, yes, there's some argument how far do you go with public ownership, but the rest is how you regulate and how many rights do you give to trade unions and strength and so on. There's both believe in market economies.
OK, and just quickly before we go to the break, focus on her bracelet.
This is fantastic. The bracelet she was wearing has a picture on it of Trotsky's lover. Here we are. What's her name?
Frida Kahlo.
Frida Kahlo, who was a bisexual feminist, communist, Trotsky. What's May? Did she know?
That's why she had a bad day. She had that old commie on her wrist.
Did she know?
She needed a proper Lucky Charm bracelet, not an old commie on there.
Well, you know, Frida Kahlo is probably, she's dead, would have had a bracelet, I've no doubt, with Jeremy Corbyn's picture on it now, wouldn't she?
It's a ghost spooked the Prime Minister.
It is an interesting choice, though, isn't it?
Very interesting. I'm sure she would have known.
Great clock by whoever spotted that.